In 1997, a phone call was made to a woman living alone in Florida. She was 82 years old. She had not been seen in public in nearly 20 years. The caller told her she was being given an award for an invention she had made 55 years earlier. An invention that had been used by the military, stolen by industry, and built into the fabric of modern life without her name attached to any of it. She listened. Then she said, "It's about time." Her name was Hedy Lamarr. Hollywood called her the most beautiful woman in the world. Louis B. Mayer, the most powerful studio head in America, told her to her face that she should keep her mouth shut and just stand there, because that was all anyone wanted from her. She held a patent that became one of the most important inventions of the 20th century. She received nothing for it, not a dollar, not a credit, not an acknowledgement during her working lifetime. The patent expired before anyone recognized what she had done. The technology built on it went on to become the foundation of some of the most valuable industries in human history. The companies that built those industries never paid her a cent. This is the story of Hedy Lamarr, the actress who invented the future, the woman nobody took seriously, and what it cost her to be brilliant in a world that only wanted her to be beautiful. Before we go further, if stories like this move you, stories about women whose genius was buried by the people around them, subscribe to Behind the Pearls and turn on notifications. Every week we open the locket on a woman history tried to reduce to a single image. Now, back to Hedy. She was born Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler on November 9, 1914, in Vienna, Austria, the only child of Emil Kiesler, a bank director, and his wife Gertrude, a concert pianist. Vienna in 1914 was one of the great intellectual capitals of the world. Sigmund Freud was practicing there. Gustav Klimt was painting there. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was at the height of its cultural grandeur, even as the political forces that would tear it apart were already gathering on every border. Into this world, Hedy Kiesler arrived with what everyone who knew her as a child described as an almost frightening level of curiosity. By the age of 5, she could disassemble and reassemble her music box to understand how it worked. Her father, Emil, was a man who believed that curiosity was the highest form of intelligence, and who spent long weekend afternoons walking with his daughter through the streets of Vienna, explaining how printing presses worked, how streetcars ran on electrical current, how every machine around them was simply a problem somebody had solved. Those walks, Hedy later said, were the foundation of everything she would later do. Her mother, Gertrude, gave her music and art and the conviction that a woman could pursue beauty and intellect simultaneously without having to choose between them. It was a conviction that the world would spend the rest of Hedy's life trying to disprove. At 16, she began studying acting with Max Reinhardt in Berlin, the most celebrated theater director in the German-speaking world. He said she had a quality of presence that the camera would find impossible to ignore. He was right about that. He could not have anticipated how much that quality of presence would eventually work against her. In 1932, at the age of 17, Hedy Kiesler appeared in a Czech film called Ecstasy. It was a small art film about a young woman trapped in a loveless marriage who finds connection with a younger man. The film contained 2 things that would follow Hedy Lamarr for the rest of her life: a brief nude scene and a close-up of her face during a moment of intimacy that was so expressively human, so startlingly real, that it became one of the most discussed scenes in European cinema of that era. The film was banned in the United States. The Vatican condemned it. Adolf Hitler reportedly banned it in Germany, and Fritz Mandl one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Austria, saw it and decided that the woman in that film was going to be his wife. Hedy was 18 years old when Fritz Mandl began pursuing her. He was 33, an arms manufacturer who had a nickname, the Merchant of Death. He supplied weapons to governments across Europe, including, as the 1930s progressed, to the fascists. He was charming, he was relentless, and he was extraordinarily wealthy at a time when the economic devastation of the Great Depression had reached even the comfortable household of a Viennese bank director. Her parents consented to the engagement. Hedy converted to Catholicism as Mandl required. They married on August 10th, 1933, at the Karlskirche in Vienna. She was 18. He was 33, and within weeks of the wedding, she understood completely what she had walked into. One episode from the early months of the marriage captures the atmosphere perfectly. A film director visited the Mandl household for dinner shortly after the wedding. He had seen ecstasy. He told Hedy that her performance had been extraordinary, that she had a quality on screen that most actors could work for decades without achieving. Fritz Mandl waited until the director had left, and then told Hedy that if she ever accepted a compliment from another man in his house again, there would be consequences. He then had his lawyers contact the director to ensure he understood that Hedy was no longer available for any professional conversation whatsoever. Fritz Mandl did not want a wife. He wanted a possession. He spent significant sums attempting to buy and destroy every existing print of ecstasy. He largely failed. He ended her acting career immediately. He required her to be present at every business dinner he hosted, dressed and jeweled and beautiful and silent, while he and his associates, some of whom were directly connected to the Nazi Party, conducted their business around her. Hedy later described the experience with a precision that is difficult to read. She said, "I was like a doll. I was like a thing, some object of art which had to be guarded and imprisoned, having no mind, no life of its own." But she was not, in fact, mindless, and the dinners that were meant to display her as a trophy were inadvertently educating her as an engineer. Think about what those dinners actually were. Fritz Mandl hosted the most powerful arms dealers, military officials, and political figures in Central Europe. Some of them were working directly with Hitler and Mussolini. They discussed torpedo guidance systems. They discussed radio jamming technology. They discussed the specific technical vulnerabilities that Allied naval forces would face in any future conflict. They discussed these things freely, in front of a beautiful young woman sitting at the end of the table, because it never occurred to any of them that she was paying attention in any meaningful way. She was decorative furniture. She was not expected to understand anything she was hearing. She understood everything. This detail matters enormously. The invention that would define her legacy and that the world would not credit her for during her lifetime did not come from nowhere. It came directly from the knowledge she acquired while being silenced and displayed at her husband's dinner table. The very imprisonment that was meant to reduce her to an object was building the understanding that would, a decade later, help change the course of the Second World War. By 1937, she had had enough. The precise details of her escape from Mandl have been disputed by biographers. The most dramatic version involved disguising herself and fleeing through a servant's entrance. Subsequent research suggests the more likely truth was quieter. She persuaded Mandl to let her attend a party wearing her finest jewelry, and then simply did not come back. Either way, she walked out wearing every piece of jewelry he had given her, caught a train to Paris, and did not stop moving until she reached London. She was 22 years old. She was alone in a foreign country with a bag of jewels, a film reputation that had preceded her everywhere as scandalous, and a mind full of everything she had learned at her husband's dinner table. In London in the summer of 1937, Hedy met Louis B. Mayer. He was the co-founder and head of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the most powerful studio in Hollywood, and he was in Europe on a talent scouting trip. On the ocean liner crossing from Europe to America, she negotiated the terms of her deal. She held out. She argued. She pushed back. She eventually signed a 7-year contract with MGM at $600 a week, contingent on her learning English. By the time the ship docked in New York, she had a new name. Lou B. Mayer renamed her Hedy Lamarr after Barbara Lamarr, a silent film star of the 1920s known as the most beautiful woman in Hollywood. The renaming was entirely characteristic of what Hollywood would do to Hedy Lamarr for the next 2 decades. Take what she was, replace it with what they wanted her to be, and present the result as if it were the complete picture. Her first American film, Algiers, released in 1938, made her an overnight sensation. Critics reached for comparisons they did not quite have language for. The films kept coming. Ziegfeld Girl, Boomtown, Tortilla Flat, White Cargo, and then, in 1949, Samson and Delilah, which became one of the highest-grossing films of the year. But throughout all of it, Hedy Lamarr was being told, in every way that Hollywood knew how to tell a woman something, that the only thing that mattered about her was what she looked like. Louis B. Mayer was particularly explicit about this. On at least one documented occasion, he told her directly, "That is the most beautiful face in the world, and that is all anyone needs from it. Stop trying to talk." MGM's management of Hedy Lamarr was a masterclass in creative suppression. When she suggested she wanted to play more complex, psychologically interesting characters, she was told that audiences did not pay money to watch her think. When she spoke in interviews about her interest in science and her work on inventions, the studio publicity department generally omitted those statements from the press releases they distributed. The image they were selling did not have room for an inventor. Hedy Lamarr had been assigned the category of face. Everything else was inconvenient. During the years she was making films for MGM, Hedy Lamarr maintained a workbench in her home, where she spent her evenings working on inventions. This was not a hobby. It was a compulsion that went back to the 5-year-old girl disassembling her music box in Vienna. The problem-solving instinct that her father had nurtured had not gone anywhere simply because Hollywood had decided her value was decorative. She worked on several inventions during this period. She designed an improved version of a traffic stoplight. She read in a medical journal about a shortage of anti-malarial drugs needed by Allied troops, and spent several weeks trying to develop a carbonated quinine tablet that soldiers could carry as compact medication. The experiment failed. She moved on to the next problem. Her son Anthony later recalled that this was simply how her mind operated. Every problem she encountered was automatically converted into a question of what could be done about it. She also became friends with Howard Hughes, one of the wealthiest and most technically ambitious men in America. She visited his aircraft factories and looked at his planes with the eyes of someone educated at Fritz Mandel's dinner table. She noticed that his aircraft had square wings and told him that the fastest birds and the fastest fish in nature did not have square wings. They had tapered, streamlined wings and fins. Hughes took her observations seriously. He brought in ornithologists and marine biologists to study the shapes she had described. He then redesigned his aircraft accordingly. He later credited her with the insight. It was characteristic of Hughes that he listened. It was characteristic of Hollywood that nobody else did. But the invention that mattered. the one that would outlast everything else, came from the knowledge she had carried out of Fritz Mandel's dining room. In 1940, at a party, Hedy met George Antheil, an avant-garde composer best known for his extraordinarily complex ballet mécanique, a composition for synchronized player pianos that had nearly caused a riot at its Carnegie Hall premiere in 1930. They began talking about the war, specifically about the problem of radio-guided torpedoes, which were being jammed by enemy forces who could detect and block the single radio frequency controlling them. Hedy had been thinking about this problem for years, drawing on what she had absorbed at Mandel's dinner table. Her idea was elegant and radical simultaneously. What if instead of transmitting on a single fixed frequency, the transmitter and the receiver synchronized themselves to hop between frequencies together, shifting constantly and randomly, so that anyone trying to jam the signal would never be able to lock onto it long enough to block it? Antheil immediately understood. His entire musical career had been built on the problem of synchronizing mechanical processes. The collaboration between Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil was one of the strangest pairings in the history of American invention. She was a movie star. He was an experimental composer dismissed by the musical establishment. Neither of them had any formal training in radio engineering or weapons technology. Both of them had something more valuable: the specific knowledge she had absorbed in Mandel's dining room, and his intimate understanding of how to synchronize two separate instruments to play the same score at the same moment, without any direct communication between them. It sounds like an unlikely foundation for a weapons patent. It was exactly the right foundation for this particular weapons patent. They filed a patent application in June 1941. On August 11, 1942, the United States Patent Office issued patent number 2,292,387 for a secret communication system to Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil. They donated the patent to the United States government. They received nothing for it. Not then, and as it turned out, not ever. The United States Navy rejected their invention. The official reason given was that the player-piano mechanism made the system too bulky for practical use on a torpedo. The unofficial reason, documented in Alexandra Dean's 2017 documentary Bombshell, The Hedy Lamarr Story, was rather more straightforward. The Navy was not willing to take seriously an invention submitted by an actress and a pianist. There was also a darker complication. Because Hedy Lamarr had been born in Austria, she was classified under American law as an enemy alien following the declaration of war. Some accounts suggest the government considered seizing the patent as enemy property rather than acknowledging it as a voluntary gift from an American resident trying to help the war effort. The patent sat on a shelf, unused, unacknowledged. Meanwhile, Hedy was told by MGM to sell war bonds. She toured the country. She was extraordinarily good at it, raising $25 million in a single evening in Washington by auctioning kisses at $1,000 each. At one event, she promised to kiss every man who bought a $100,000 bond. She raised $7 million that night alone. Her face, once again, was what was needed. Her mind was not. She tried one more time. In 1943, she wrote to the National Inventors Council, asking if there was any other way she could contribute her technical knowledge to the war effort. The council's response was to suggest she might be more useful continuing to sell war bonds. The patent expired in 1959. George Antheil died the same year, never having received any recognition or payment for their invention. In the years that followed, the military began developing electronic versions of frequency hopping technology. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, American naval vessels used a frequency-hopping guidance system in the most dangerous military confrontation since the Second World War. The patent that had been ignored and had expired 3 years earlier was being actively used in the most consequential standoff of the Cold War. Nobody called Hedy Lamarr. The technology continued to spread. It became the foundation of secure military communications. Then it moved into civilian life. The principles behind patent number 2292-387 became the foundation of technologies that today connect billions of people across the world every single day. You have used them today without knowing her name. You used them yesterday. You will use them tomorrow. The companies that built those technologies made billions. Hedy Lamarr received nothing. The 1950s were not kind to Hedy Lamarr on any front. Her film career had begun its decline in the late 1940s. Hollywood was changing. The studio system that had created stars and kept them was breaking apart. Television was pulling audiences away from cinemas. And Hedy Lamarr, who had never been allowed to be more than her face in Hollywood, found that as her face aged, the industry had nothing left to offer her. She had married 6 times. Fritz Mandel, the arms dealer she had escaped, Jean Markey, a screenwriter in 1939, John Loder, a British actor in 1943 with whom she had 2 children, Anthony and Denise, Ernest Stauffer in 1951, lasting only a matter of months, Howard Lee in 1953, lasting 5 years, Louis Boys, a lawyer in 1963 from whom she was divorced by 1965. 6 marriages. None of them lasted. It is worth understanding what those marriages were actually about, because the 6 marriage detail has been used repeatedly as evidence of instability. The more honest reading is different. She was a woman who had been imprisoned in her first marriage, who had escaped at enormous personal risk, and who spent the rest of her life looking for a genuine partnership between equals. She did not find it. That is not evidence of her deficiency. It is evidence of how rare such a thing was for a woman of her era and her profile. Every man who married her wanted, to varying degrees, what Mandel had wanted: the possession, the face, the ornament. Not one of them was fully equipped to be with someone who was also designing weapons patents at a workbench in the evenings. In 1966, she published an autobiography called Ecstasy and Me, which she later disowned, claiming the ghostwriter had fabricated significant portions. She sued the publisher. She won. The book remained in print regardless. By the 1970s, she had retreated almost completely from public life. She moved to Florida. She had several encounters with the law involving shoplifting charges that generated humiliating headlines. She became, in the press, a figure of sad comedy, the once beautiful actress who had lost her looks and her grip. Nobody mentioned the patent. Nobody mentioned what she had invented. She had a telephone. She had time, and she spent both of them talking to her son Anthony, who later recalled that even into her 80s she was constantly generating ideas, constantly seeing solutions to problems, her mind as restless and inventive as it had always been. The workbench was still there. The mind was still there. The world had simply stopped looking. And then came that phone call in 1997. The Electronic Frontier Foundation told her she was being given their Pioneer Award for the invention of frequency-hopping technology, an invention from 1942, an invention that had been shelved by the Navy, used without credit by the military, and built into the fabric of the modern world without her name attached to any of it. She was 82 years old. She accepted the award by telephone. When the journalist asked how she felt about finally being recognized after all these years, she paused. Then she said, "It's about time." On January 19th, 2000, Hedy Lamarr died at her home in Castleberry, Florida. She was 85 years old. She was alone. Her son Anthony told the press, "She was such a creative person. Non-stop solution finding. If you talked about a problem, she had a solution." In 2014, 14 years after her death, she was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. History has given Hedy Lamarr a comfortable recent rehabilitation. She is now celebrated as a pioneer, the most beautiful woman in the world who was also a genius. The story has become, in recent years, almost a feel-good one. Society was wrong about her. And now we know better. That rehabilitation is deserved. But it is also slightly too comfortable. Because the more accurate story is not simply that society failed to recognize her genius. It is that society actively, deliberately, systematically prevented her from exercising it. Louis B. Mayer did not simply overlook her intelligence. He told her to stop talking. The United States Navy did not simply fail to appreciate her patent. They dismissed it because an actress and a pianist could not possibly know what they were doing. The companies that built industries on her foundational work did not simply forget to credit her. They had no mechanism for crediting her because she had already been written out of the story before the story had even properly begun. She spent her career being told that beauty and intelligence were mutually exclusive, that a woman who looked the way she looked could not also think the way she thought, that the most useful thing she could do with her mind was keep it hidden behind her face. She refused to accept that. She worked on inventions at her workbench every evening after filming. She filed patents. She talked to engineers and composers and aviators and tried, consistently and without recognition, to contribute something beyond what she looked like. And she did. Hedy Lamarr once said, "Any girl can be glamorous. All you have to do is stand still and look stupid." She spent her entire life refusing to do either. Before we close, if you have stayed this far and this story has moved you, now is the perfect moment to subscribe to Behind the Pearls. Every week we tell the stories of women whose genius the world tried to bury. She was born curious in a city that prized beauty. She escaped a man who wanted to imprison her mind and carried his weapons knowledge out of his dining room in her memory. She crossed an ocean and built a new life in a language she did not yet speak. She invented a technology that changed the world while Hollywood was telling her to stand still and look beautiful. And she died alone in Florida, 85 years old, recognized too late, and compensated never. Behind the Pearls exists for this. For the women the world reduced to their surfaces, for the inventors who were told to go sell war bonds instead, for the geniuses who were handed awards at 82 and told it is about time, as if that was adequate, as if time was the only thing that had been owed to them. Hedy Lamarr deserved better. So did the world that benefited from her mind without ever properly thanking her for it.